Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare Om Jnanatimirandasya Jnananjana Salakaya Chakshurumilitam Yena Tasmai Sri Gurave Namaha.
Hare Krishna. So
Hare
we
Krishna.
have today Kurma Prabhu, the famous cook and author of cookbooks and teachers of cooking, Vaishnava cooking. We thank him very much for participating in this project of the GBC Strategic Planning team. You're welcome, Kurma Prabhu.
Thank you for having me.
So this is a special project. It's entitled Srila Prabhupada's Journey to the Far Corners of the World. And so we are interviewing a number of Srila Prabhupada disciples who were very instrumental in pioneering the movement in different parts of the world, especially parts which may be considered a little bit far from the usual itinerary of India, Europe, and North America. I just want to tell you a few things about Kurma Prabhu in case you don't know him very well. He was born in England, but he moved with his family to Australia when he was only 12 years old. And he became initiated by Srila Prabhupada in May 1971 in Sydney. And there is where he started his cooking career by washing pots, cutting vegetables, and so on. And then he, from these humble beginnings, he has gone on to teach a special brand of elegant and eclectic gourmet vegetarian cuisine throughout the world. So he was head chef at the Gopal's, very famous vegetarian restaurant in Melbourne, and he's author of a number of books. Great Vegetarian Dishes, which is in the 8th print edition, Cooking with Kurma, Quick Vegetarian Dishes, and most recently, Vegetarian World Food. All books which have received wide acclaim from professionals and the readers. Okay, so
And an Italian copy of Great Vegetarian Dishes too.
Okay, so I've been also different translations.
Yeah.
I see that have been translated into Hungarian, in Italian, in German, and in Farsi. Okay, then today is talking to us from the Green Island of Ireland, and we wish you all of you a very happy Janmashtami, if Janmashtami is today for you, because I know it was yesterday in North America. And if it's Vyasa Puja for you, Srila Prabhupada Vyasa Puja, very happy Srila Prabhupada Vyasa Puja. Here in Mayapur, it would be tomorrow. So in any case, we are in a very festive mood, very important celebrations. And today we'll meditate on Srila Prabhupada mission and Srila Prabhupada missionaries. So, the first question I would like to ask to Kurma Prabhu is, looking at today's topic, someone may first ask, why did Srila Prabhupada travel to the far corners of the world? What was the intent or motivation?
Yes, good question. May I just mention that I can hear someone speaking in the background. I don't know whether that's a fault on my end or your end, but it's rather loud.
I'm just muting.
Right. Now, thank you very much for that introduction. And thank you for reiterating the topic, which is Srila Prabhupada's journey to the far corners of the world. Yes. And I'd like to just quote you a wonderful quote from Srila Prabhupada, which really sums up this whole, not only my presentation today, but everybody's. Prabhupada actually gave so much credit to these devotees that were going to these far distant places. This is actually from a lecture that Srila Prabhupada gave in Vrindavan in 1976. He said, Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu wanted that prativite ache yatanagaradi grama savatra pacha hoibe no more nam. He wanted that everywhere, in every nook and corner of the world, every city, every town, every village, there should be the chanting of the Hare Krishna Mahamantra. The chanting should be preached. So by his grace, it is going on. Now, in the remotest part of the world, even in Australia, the southernmost part of this globe, there also we have got 4 branches, Melbourne, Sydney, and we have got a very big building of Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. So last year I established this temple, and many hundreds and thousands of devotees are coming. So certainly Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's foretelling is now spreading. So Prabhupada called Australia the southernmost part of this globe, which in fact it is.
So, would you like to tell us something, or how did the Sankirtan movement first came to Australia?
I would. But before I do that, I'm going to mention a little point here about someone might ask why Srila Prabhupada actually did travel to all the far corners of the world. I compiled a little list. This little list can be applied to all Prabhupada's travelings around the world. Number 1, Prabhupada travelled to fulfill the orders of his spiritual master. And interestingly, in connection with Australia, Srila Bhaktivedanta Saraswati Thakur never mentioned Australia, which is understandable. And he never mentioned any country specifically, yet Prabhupada knew that there was a desperate need to spread Krishna consciousness everywhere. The second point that I've written here is that Prabhupada traveled to enliven his disciples. Why did Prabhupada travel? Actually, Prabhupada said, quote, "I'm always praying that my disciples should gradually increase our war against Maya on all fronts." Number 3, Prabhupada traveled to teach and demonstrate how to solve all the problems of the world. He wrote to Hanuman Prasad Poddar that practically, he said, "I have experienced that this Krishna consciousness movement can solve all the problems of the world." Number 4, Prabhupada traveled not to please himself for sightseeing, but to please others. Prabhupada traveled to please others. He said, "I have come here in this old age, neither for sightseeing, neither for personal interest. It is for implementing the science of Krishna, which is actually making people happy." Number 5, Prabhupada traveled to demonstrate how to establish the highest welfare work. Prabhupada said that real auspiciousness in the world is distributing spiritual knowledge. Number 6, Prabhupada traveled to systematically implement the science of Krishna in all parts of the world. Number 7, Prabhupada traveled, and his disciples traveled on his behalf to fulfill the prophecy of Lord Chaitanya. And the last point here, which is an interesting point that Prabhupada made when he was in Australia, he said that he used the term colonization by Sankirtan. So Prabhupada's travels to Australia and to everywhere, in fact, were part of a plan to colonize the whole world with devotees. Prabhupada said in this connection in a very nice letter that he wrote to Bali Mardana, "As formerly the Europeans made colonization in different parts of the world, it is the same thing. Colonization by Sankirtan in Krishna consciousness. Formerly, your forefathers, many Europeans and American gentlemen, were courageous to go outside of their country for colonization. And Australia is a vivid example of such adventures. Now, by the grace of Krishna, yourself and Upendra, the descendants of your adventurous forefathers, have gone there with a great mission." I thought I can't hear you actually at this point.
Sorry about that. Yeah, this is a very comprehensive answer on the motivation and the why. And maybe you'd like to say a few things on the how actually Krishna consciousness came to Australia.
Very important. Very important. Well, how did it all start? Actually, in America, of course, Srila Prabhupada was expanding his movement. Between 1965 and 1967, Prabhupada concentrated on spreading Krishna consciousness in America. And then he got sick, and then he went to Vrindavan. And then when he came back from Vrindavan, that's when really there was a huge explosion of opening centers throughout the world. Prabhupada was in Montreal in 1968, and he was corresponding with one disciple called Chidananda. Chidananda, he was very enlivened to see all his godbrothers opening up temples around America. So Chidananda Das decided that he would like to go to Australia. He wrote to Srila Prabhupada, and Prabhupada said, yes, that's a wonderful idea. When you go to Australia, he said, bring lots of kartals and mridangas. And he gave him so many instructions. However, Chidananda applied to the immigration department in Australia in an incorrect way, and his application was turned down. So he never got to go. But meanwhile, there was a disciple of Srila Prabhupada called Bali Mardana, who was a brahmachari in Japan. He was preaching with Sudama, and every Sunday he would invite people back to the Sunday feast. One day, an Australian boy came to the Sunday feast and said, hey, you guys should go to Australia. I hear they're really involved with yoga and meditation and stuff. So Bali Madan got the idea that it would be nice to go to Australia. So he suggested that to Srila Prabhupada, and Srila Prabhupada said, it's a wonderful idea. He wrote him so many nice letters. Krishna is giving you intelligence from within, how to become a preacher in distant countries to fulfill the mission of Lord Chaitanya, etc. So while this application was being processed for him to go to Australia, on the other side of America, there was one disciple of Srila Prabhupada called Upendra, a young blonde American disciple of Prabhupada who had recently been Prabhupada's personal servant. Just before that, he was the temple president in Seattle, and he preferred being Prabhupada's personal servant. One day, he came to Srila Prabhupada in his room, and he said, Prabhupada, I've got this letter that was sent out by a devotee called Bali Madan, who I don't know, and he sent a letter out to all the temple presidents in the world saying, do you have any devotees in your temple that would like to come to Australia and help me? And Upendra said to Prabhupada, but I'm not the temple president anymore, so I don't know who to give this letter to. And Prabhupada, he looked at Upendra. Upendra wrote, I interviewed Upendra. Upendra said, I guess Krishna must have really covered my intelligence, because I said, Prabhupada, what can you suggest someone to go to Australia? That was the mistake. Prabhupada just looked at Upendra as if to say, you can go to Australia. And Upendra realized that Prabhupada wanted him to go. And he said, no, Prabhupada, I'm not asking to go to Australia. And Prabhupada said, yes, you should go to Australia. He said, no, but I'm serving you here. I'm doing your cooking. I'm doing your massage. And Prabhupada said, anyone can rub a little oil and do a massage. You should go and preach. He said, you were doing better when you were the temple president. You go to Australia. And that was it. So Upendra was set himself basically a goal that he was going to find out as much as he could about Australia, and he went. But meanwhile, Bali Madan had landed in Australia in 1969, and he came to Australia on his own with practically no money and a few Back to Godhead magazines. And he started chanting Hare Krishna in a park in King's Cross, which was sort of like the go-to place in Sydney. It was sort of like the Greenwich Village of Australia. So he started chanting on the street. He inquired from Macmillan Company in North Sydney, and he found out that they had a big stock of Prabhupada's Bhagavad Gitas. So he bought them all on consignment, and he started distributing those books all around Sydney. Now, the fact that Prabhupada had only sent one devotee at this point, because Upendra hadn't arrived, he'd only sent one devotee at that point. And but this was not an unusual fact. Prabhupada often sent single devotees to cities. Prabhupada said, if there is one sincere soul, that is sufficient to start a center. Prabhupada, in fact, in his first year in America, he'd been, quote unquote, alone. At least it appeared that way. Prabhupada said, he said, I was seemingly alone for 1 year, but I never felt alone. I always felt the presence of my Guru Maharaj. A Vaishnava, he said, is never alone. So Bali Madan sat down and started chanting Hare Krishna on the street. And a few interested passers-by came, and gradually the word was out that there was the Hare Krishnas were in town. And then Upendra joined him. So then there were 2 devotees in Sydney.
So these are the 2 first
Yeah.
devotees. And please tell us about some of the other earliest devotees who joined in Australia. Are they still with us? What are they doing these days?
Good question. So what happened was, because they knew that if they just chanted Hare Krishna on the street sincerely, Prabhupada told them that I never thought about an audience. He said, I was prepared to chant even if there was no one to hear me. So Prabhupada said the actual principle of chanting was to glorify the Lord and not attract a crowd. Nevertheless, he said, if Krishna hears nicely, then he will ask some sincere devotees to go and gather in such place. So it seems that these devotees had been, that started coming, were planted by Krishna. Some of them were living there, some of them had just arrived there. But I'll tell you about some of them anyway. There are many, I've described many in my book, but I've decided that I think that the devotees that are probably the most well-known in our society today would be Jagatarini, who's the wife of Burjan. A couple of Swedish boys were living in Sydney. They had travelled over, they'd been hitchhiking throughout Europe and they'd come to Australia. They became Ajit and Vegavan, who you're interviewing, Vegavan, someone is soon. And Chiru and Vaibhavi, who of course are running our Krishna Consciousness Center there in Utah. They were the first ones to express interest in Sydney. They were all in Australia for different reasons. For instance, Jagatarini, she was a film actress who was originally from Melbourne, and she starred in a movie with Mick Jagger about a famous Australian criminal called Ned Kelly. And she was living in King's Cross, which was where the devotees were chanting. And one day she saw the devotees singing on the street, and she said, "Are you Buddhists?" And they said, "No, we're actually Hare Krishna devotees." And they gave her a mantra card. So Jagatarini at this time was taking singing lessons. So she decided that she'd sing the Hare Krishna mantra as part of her training. So she started chanting Hare Krishna at home, just to practice her ability to project her voice. But of course, the mantra had its effects, and so she came to the temple and she got interested. But then she discovered that the whole temple basically was just one room, and the devotees lived out of very austere situations. Bali Madan asked her, would she like to join the temple? She said, "No, I'm not interested in joining the temple." She became a little nervous, and she decided that she would go to America and proceed on with her acting career. Before she went to live in America, one of the ladies in the temple gave her a pen, and they said, "If you happen to see Srila Prabhupada in America, would you give him this pen as a gift?" So she said, "Yeah, sure, no problems." And anyway, she went to America. She tried to get into Hollywood. She was very discouraged. It was very difficult. And one day she saw the devotees chanting on Hollywood Boulevard, and she joined in. And then she went to the temple in Watsika Avenue. Prabhupada was there. She gave Prabhupada the pen. She joined the temple in Los Angeles, and she never left. But her first contact was in Sydney. And then 2 Swedish boys, Willie and Jürgen, they met the devotees in Sydney. They were very interested. They'd read the Bhagavad Gita. They found Prabhupada's Bhagavad Gita while they were hitchhiking through the Himalayas. And they visited the Sydney temple. Also, they were not so inclined to move into the temple straight away. Ajit decided he'd continue on with his hitchhiking. He did eventually come back. He was initiated with me in the first initiations in Sydney. Vegavan and his girlfriend at the time, Marian, they decided to go to India to fulfill their dream. And when they went to India, they went to Bombay, and they met the devotees and Srila Prabhupada at the Cross Maidan Pandal. Actually, they visited the temple in Bombay in the Akash Ganga buildings, and then they attended the Cross Maidan Pandal, and Bhagavan was initiated and married to his wife Padmavati at the Pandal, and in front of 30,000 people. Prabhupada said, this is the real United Nations. This boy is from Sweden, this girl is from Australia. And then when Prabhupada came to Sydney, the first visit, he took Bhagavan back to Australia with him as his servant. And then, of course, there was Bhakta Chris and Bhakteen Christine. Who,
I was wondering if you are also were one of the early devotees. Tell us something autobiographical.
Well, yeah. Interestingly enough, I didn't meet the devotees directly in this time, but it took me another 9 months or so, and I met Upendra. I didn't actually meet Upendra directly, but I met Upendra via my father. My father was walking down the street, coming home from work. Upendra offered him some literature. He took the literature. He reluctantly gave a donation. It was actually a single-sheeted piece of paper with some information about the chanting of the Hare Krishna mantra. My father took this piece of paper home, and he knew I was interested in sort of Eastern philosophy. My father says, I don't know what the hell this is about. I met this guy on the street. He said, maybe you'll be interested in it. And I stuck the piece of paper up on my wall, and there was the Maha Mantra. And I became a devotee from my father meeting Upendra. So, and of course, another interesting thing was that my mother also met one of the first brahmacharis from the Sydney temple, who came into the shop where she was working, a handicrafts of India shop, and she sold them some vases to go on their altar. So my parents actually introduced me to Krishna consciousness. I came home from school. My mother said, hey, I met a monk today. And I said, oh, was it a Tibetan monk? Because I was into Tibetan monks. And she said, no, he was from California. His name was Bill. His name was Bill. And that he, of course, he became Upananda. And so my parents introduced me to Krishna consciousness.
Well, now you told us something about the first devotees, which included you. Would you like to tell us something about how and when and under what circumstances the Srila Prabhupada himself personally set foot on Australian soil?
Yeah, well, Bhakta Chris moved into the temple with Bhakteen Christine, and they got initiated. Charu got initiated by male. Bhakta Chris became Kurma Dasa, and his wife was initiated later on when Prabhupada came. But then Bali Madan and Upendra, they moved on. Bali Madan went to Fiji to open up a temple, and Upendra, and Upendra went somewhere else and just left Bhakta Chris as the temple president. And then he got his initiation letter, and he was running the temple on his own, and he was a brand new devotee. And one day he got a letter. He tells the story here. One day I got a letter from Karanda. He said that Prabhupada was going to be visiting Moscow, and that every temple president should write a letter inviting Prabhupada to visit them. Charu said, at that time I was a brand new devotee. I didn't know anything. I was thinking of Srila Prabhupada in kind of material terms. I was thinking that surely a 72-year-old man wouldn't want to travel all the way to Australia. He said that I couldn't know that Prabhupada was destined to circle the world 12 times in as many years. All the stories that Upendra used to regale us with were with Prabhupada in San Francisco. And I had a picture of him being more or less stationary. But anyway, Charu sent a letter of invitation to Prabhupada. He knew that he would have to pay for air tickets, and he didn't know how on earth he would raise the money. But anyway, Prabhupada wrote back and said, yes, we're coming. He said, we're coming in May. So Prabhupada somehow or other accepted the invitation, although Charu never thought that Prabhupada would actually come. And he did a fundraiser, and someone came along and donated a whole lot of money. And so he was able to pay for Prabhupada's air ticket, Bhagavan's air ticket, and Bali Madan's air ticket. So Prabhupada actually arrived on May the 9th, 1971. And he initiated everyone in the temple on May the 10th, including myself. Anyone that was a devotee, someone had shaved their beard off the day before. He became Bhajana Das. I just shaved my head 4 weeks before I got initiated, Kurma Dasa. And everyone that was in the temple got initiated. Prabhupada was extremely kind and merciful. And he also installed Sri Sri Radha Gopinath, the presiding deities of Sydney Temple.
Mm-hmm. Now, in terms of observation, did Srila Prabhupada do anything differently in Australia compared to other parts of the world? What's your observation and analysis?
Well, having not been in every country of the world, I can't say for sure, although I've read a lot about Prabhupada in forms of various biographical and historical books. So there are a couple of things which jumped out at me. The first thing is that when Prabhupada wanted to expand the Krishna consciousness movement in Australia, Prabhupada always preferred that local people should join. He didn't want us to import people from other places. He wanted the Australian temples to be filled with Australians, and the Swedish temple, he was hoping that it would be full of Swedish boys and girls, etc., etc. But Prabhupada did something a bit unusual in Australia at first. He conceived of a unique plan, and he coordinated this with Mukunda in London, because Australia had this policy of immigration, and that Australian government would pay for the air ticket of the person coming to Australia. If they wanted to live there, you would have to pay $20, and the Australian government would pay the rest. And so Prabhupada arranged with Mukunda to send brahmacharis from London to man the Sydney temple. So he sent one devotee called Tirthapada. You can hear Tirthapada playing Mridanga on the Govindam album, playing Mridanga on the Govinda Jaya Jaya track. He was a good Mridanga player. He was also a carpenter and a good all-around devotee. And so he came to Sydney Temple, and all the things that he learnt in London with the devotees that were there, he shared with us in Australia, because we were very isolated. So that's one thing that Prabhupada did. And another thing that Prabhupada did in Australia was that it was a matter of, I suppose, how everything is emphasized. It was a matter of emphasis. Prabhupada wanted us to do everything that we did in other temples of the world, distribute prasadam, have kirtan, distribute books. But he found that Australians weren't very philosophical. They were very simple-hearted, unsophisticated people. He gave a class at the Sydney Town Hall in 1973. There were 2,000 people there. He asked for questions, and it was completely quiet. Completely quiet. Prabhupada said to Madhavisa, he said, are there no questions? And Madhavisa said, no, Srila Prabhupada. So he said, so have kirtan. And he left the stage. And on the way back to the temple, he said, he was disappointed. He said, there were no questions. He said, Australians, he said, they are simply meatheads. That was a quote, unquote. He said, they are simply meatheads. They're not very interested in philosophy. He said, that is all right. So give them prasadam and kirtan. So he stressed prasadam and kirtan mainly in Australia, because we weren't very sophisticated. We were not philosophers. And because of this, the Australian devotees took to heart this prasadam distribution. And so we find that in Australia today, there are, close to 20 restaurants. Millions and millions of plates of prasadam have been distributed. And when we do rock festivals and folk festivals, where there's tens of thousands of people coming, the devotees are there with elaborate tents and pandals, and they distribute tens and tens of thousands of plates of prasadam. They sell them, make lots of money. And in Australia, to this very day, when you say Hare Krishna to someone, you can see their mouth is starting to water, and they start thinking about those kofta balls and that halwa, because people in Australia, they just adore prasadam. So Prabhupada knew exactly, he had his finger on the pulse of the Australian people, and he knew we should emphasize more than anything else, we should emphasize prasadam and kirtan.
Thank you very much. So you have written a 800 pages book, The Great Transcendental Adventure, and it took you 5 years of interviewing different devotees, so a lot of work. So what inspired you to write that book?
Well, we had a Prabhupada reunion. I organized a reunion of Prabhupada's disciples in 1992. And we got devotees from all around the world. When I was traveling and interviewing people, I got all their contacts because I spent 3 years traveling around the world interviewing people. Well, actually, that came afterwards. But anyway, we emphasized, we discussed all of Prabhupada's pastimes in Australia with the devotees that were there. We were reminiscing, and someone said, someone should write all this down. Someone should write all this down. And I thought to myself, yeah, maybe I'd like to write it down. So then we started this project where I would travel and interview and meet up with all the devotees, because they weren't all living in Australia anymore. They'd gone to, Bhagavan was in Scandinavia, and Charu was in Utah with his wife Vaibhavi, and devotees, Gaur Mandala Bhumi was in Indonesia, and devotees had gone everywhere, all over the world. Some devotees were in Hong Kong. So I traveled everywhere and I interviewed them, and came up with a vast amount of information, and along with that information, I added information from Prabhupada's audio recordings, his morning walk conversations, room conversations, letters, books, media coverages from newspapers, magazines, television interviews, films, photographs, and all the oral history that I had accumulated in the interviews. And that I put it all together, and we came up with a very nice snapshot of the whole history of the Australian Yatra.
And would you like to share with us some episodes, some leela, something that is especially significant for you or for the whole Australian Yatra from your book?
Of course, it's a big book and there's lots of information, as you said. I think one of the most interesting and timely topics that I speak about in this book is about how the devotees in Australia went to jail for Krishna. We went to jail for Lord Chaitanya. Recently, a godbrother of mine, Sanak, passed away in Australia. He was unwell, so we brought him back to Australia for medical treatment, as we did for Upendra some years previously, because we all felt a strong sense of kinship. Now, Sanak and I went to jail on a couple of occasions for chanting Hare Krishna on the street and not paying fines for distribution of Back to Godhead magazines. So they charged us, we didn't show up in court, and then they arrested us and threw us into jail. And it was uncomfortable. Sometimes getting thrown into jail was a very traumatic experience. But anyway, getting thrown into jail was a pattern that started very early in the Australian history. This also happened in England and other places. The first time the devotees were thrown into jail, they were mortified, and they wrote to Prabhupada, and he wrote back and he said, regarding harassment of our devotees, yes, this is not a new thing in the history of the world, that preachers are sometimes persecuted. But at the present status of civilization, I do not think anybody will be crucified like Lord Jesus Christ. Hiranyakashipu, Prabhupada said, persecuted his own son of only 5 years old. So the demons and the atheists are always prepared to give trouble to the devotees. Sometimes the demons like Kamsa are prepared to kill God even. During Lord Chaitanya's time, Thakur Haridas was persecuted and put into jail. Not only that, he was whipped in 22 marketplaces, but still the demons could not come out successful in the snubbing down of our Hare Krishna movement. So don't be worried about this. Go on about your business. Krishna will give you all help. Rest assured. Simply stick to your work seriously and sincerely. So this set the theme, and we thought, yes, let's do this, and we don't care if we go to jail. Prabhupada said, if you're in jail, you can just chant Hare Krishna. I remember I was in jail for a few hours with Bhagavan and some other devotees. We were locked up we were arrested while we were on Harinam Sankirtan, and we were sitting there in the jail, and Bhagavan said, I'm going to teach you a song. And he taught us Jaya Radha Madhava. He'd just come back from India with Srila Prabhupada, and he taught us the Jaya. I remember learning the song while we were in jail, and we were singing our lungs out in jail, and it was wonderful. And so being thrown into jail was a common event. And later on, it got very, very serious. And so we thought we'd get some legal representation. And Prabhupada said, don't waste your money on legal representation. Better go to jail and attract the sympathy of the general public. Get as much publicity as you can. And eventually, the police will be so embarrassed because people will be saying, hey, you guys, leave those Hare Krishnas alone. And that's exactly what happened. There were news articles and people were saying, it's not nice, these Hare Krishnas, they're gentle people. And Prabhupada said that eventually they will stop arresting us because they will be simply embarrassed by the bad publicity. And that's exactly what happened. So at the end of the whole epic 6 years of being harassed by the police in Australia, it got to the point in 1976 when we had $60,000 worth of unpaid fines. $60,000 worth of unpaid fines was a lot of money in 1976. And we were going to jail and we were not paying the fines. And eventually they just became so frustrated, the Melbourne City Council, the Sydney City Council and the police, they just dropped all the charges. They forgot about the money and we carried on regardless. So Prabhupada told us what to do. We did it. Being simple, rugged Australians, we embraced the idea of going to jail, and it all came out exactly as Srila Prabhupada had predicted.
Very, very interesting and heart-rending. Now, we heard that there was also an attempt at creating some sort of political party, or at least running for some local elections, similar to what they were trying to do in North America. You'd like to tell us something about that?
Oh yeah, that was a devotee called Sabapati Das. He thought he heard that Bhaktivedanta had run for, correct me if I'm wrong, mayor, I think, of Atlanta. I could be wrong, or maybe he was running for some elections, general elections, local elections. I'm sorry, I don't have those notes on me. But anyway, he became enlivened, and he said, "Yeah, why don't I run for the local elections in Melbourne, Australia?" And so he ran for politics, and he started his own political party, and because he followed the rules and regulations of the electoral procedures, he actually became, his name was there listed on the ballot papers, and he based his campaign on becoming God conscious. And of course, it was not going to attract a huge amount of attention, but he got 300 and something votes in the general elections, and he attracted lots and lots of attention. And Prabhupada wrote to Sabapati after the elections, and he said, "You should know that even though there was not a lot of votes for you," he said that every vote was a vote for Krishna. And he said, all these people, they're making great spiritual advancement. So we tried all sorts of different preaching tactics in Australia, and that was an interesting one. That was 1974.
So thank you so much. You told us about the first visit of Srila Prabhupada and the first initiation he gave in Sydney. Now, would you like to tell us something more about other visits and maybe to other cities or different years?
Yes, well, Prabhupada actually visited Australia 6 times. And I think that's not a common event because Prabhupada, it was a very difficult, any time Prabhupada came to Australia, he was coming from India or from Europe. And sometimes he'd fly via Southeast Asia, but it was a very long trip. And Prabhupada was becoming very elderly at this time. But nevertheless, Prabhupada, because there was a loving reciprocation between Madhurvisa Swami, who was the GBC in Australia at the time, and Srila Prabhupada. Prabhupada loved Madhurvisa, and Madhurvisa loved Prabhupada. And so Madhurvisa kept inviting Prabhupada to Australia, and he kept accepting the invitation. So Prabhupada came, that first visit in 71, and then he came back 72, 73, 74. He danced at the Rath Yatra Festival in Melbourne in 1974. In 1973, he installed the beautiful deities in Melbourne Temple, Sri Sri Radha Vallabha in Melbourne Temple. Actually, in 1972, he installed the small deities of Radha and Krishna that are still there. And then in 1974, as I said, he came and he installed, who did he install in 1974? Lord Jagannath, of course. He became installed by appearing on the Rath Yatra cart. And Prabhupada danced in ecstasy in Melbourne at the Rath Yatra Festival. And then Prabhupada came back again in 1975, and he installed the huge gourmet deities that are in Melbourne Temple to this very day. And those deities weigh 500 kilograms each. At the time, they were the biggest deities to ever be of Gaurnitai ever to be cast in Bengal. They were shipped to Australia. We had a huge opening of the temple. Meanwhile, Prabhupada visited New Zealand. Australia and New Zealand sort of go hand in hand, and he installed the deities of Radha Giridhari in Auckland. So the southernmost area of the world, there's so many beautiful temples and beautiful deities. Prabhupada's last visit to Australia was in 1976. And during that time, Prabhupada initiated over 200 disciples, 250 disciples. And I got to interview many of them for my book. Some of them have passed away. While Prabhupada was in Australia, he actually took a total of 75 morning walks, and most of those have been recorded. He gave 68 morning and evening classes on Bhagavad Gita and Srimad Bhagavatam. You'll hear all those as well. He met all sorts of people in his rooms, journalists, many religious leaders, the Bishop of Melbourne, all sorts of religious leaders. Prabhupada wrote his preface to Bhagavad Gita as it is on his first visit to Sydney. You can read the preface to Bhagavad Gita. It's signed May the 12th, 1971, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami, Sydney. And Prabhupada wanted that 10 temples would be opened in Australia. That was his desire. He presided over 11 fire sacrifices, as I said, initiated over 200 disciples, and he wanted that we would open 10 temples. And 10 temples were, in fact, opened in Australia. So we fulfilled Prabhupada's desires in that regards.
Now, maybe our listeners and viewers are wondering where they can get your book. I understand that it was also included in the Bhaktivedanta database, right? The folio.
Yes, it's on the database. It is on the database. Okay. If you prefer to read a hardcover book, which I do, and look at all the pictures and look at the index, etc., etc. There are copies. It's almost out of print. We're hoping to reprint it. There are some copies left available in the BBT in Sydney. And if devotees write me a message on Facebook or they send me an email, I can provide them the details of how to order a copy of the book. My email address is Kurma Dasa one word, at gmail.com, Kurma Dasa at gmail.com, or you can drop me a line on Facebook. And there's still some copies available. And it's I must say, even though I wrote it myself, it is a very good book. A lot of devotees have told me it's one of the nicest books about Srila Prabhupada that they've read.
So I put your email on the screen. Can you see it? Is the correct kurmadasa at gmail.com?
Perfect.
Okay. So if you want the hard copy and you don't know how to get it, please write Kurma Prabhu directly. Now, on a more personal level, I wanted to ask you, what quality of Srila Prabhupada stands out for you as the most impressive, and why?
That's a very good question, and I thank you for asking that. Recently, I gave a Sunday feast talk about Narada Muni transforming Mrigari the hunter. And I was very impressed when Parvata Muni, of course, was a friend of Narada. And after Narada had transformed Mrigari from being a vicious killer into a saint, because as Parvata and Narada Muni were approaching the ashram where Mrigari and his wife were chanting Hare Krishna in front of Tulsi, they saw that Mrigari got up, but he was trying to walk towards the great sages, but he was having difficulty. He was doing a little dance, and what is he doing? He's actually trying not to step on the ants. And Parvata Muni was very impressed that here was a man who was a vicious killer, and now he's become a saint. And Parvata Muni said to Narada, Dekhiya Byodera Prem Parvata Mahamuni Naradera Kohe Tumi Hao Sparshamani. He said that you are a touchstone. Narada Muni, you are a touchstone. So my meditation lately, I've been thinking how Srila Prabhupada was our touchstone. In fact, Bhaktivedanta Thakur wrote that the position of a Vaishnava can be tested by seeing how good a touchstone he is, by seeing how many Vaishnavas he has made in his lifetime. So he said that a Vaishnava should become a touchstone so that he can transform others into saintly persons, no matter how wretched and fallen they are. So I was thinking of myself and thinking of so many of Prabhupada's Western devotees. We came from a very fallen condition, but somehow or other, so many of these devotees have become very wonderful, great, saintly persons by being touched by Srila Prabhupada. Prabhupada actually has transformed hunter-like persons. We were all hunting for sense gratification in this material world, and he's transformed us all into being ladies and gentlemen. So our lives have been transformed by Prabhupada, and it's our duty to transform the lives of others. We should become touchstones, and we should touch the lives of others by our preaching. So this is my meditation on Srila Prabhupada at the moment.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing. Now, you have been cooking and teaching cooking for more than 40 years. And you've been teaching in temples, in colleges, in cooking schools, in restaurants, in private homes. Can you tell us how all this cooking, all this focus on prasadam helped you understand Srila Prabhupada as a meditation, or helped you understand this aspect of the mission of Srila Prabhupada? And what inspired you to take it so much seriously and dedicate your life basically as your main service?
Okay, well, my first reason for entering the kitchen and doing cooking service was that I'd be very close to the Mahaprasadam. I cannot tell a lie. I just was a hungry young teenager when I became a devotee, a very hungry young boy. In fact, when Prabhupada was in Australia, he told us that when he gave us a personal instruction that when you cook for Krishna, you should meditate that you're cooking for a hungry 16-year-old boy. Because in America, at one stage, devotees, they had small deities of Radha and Krishna, and so they would make little puris and little pakoras and little bowls of sabji and tiny little Simply Wonderfuls and offer it on a little plate, because they thought, well, because Krishna's little, we'll give him a little plate. Prabhupada said, no, this is wrong. You should make a big plate, and you should meditate that Krishna is a hungry 16-year-old boy. Now, for those of you that have been hungry 16-year-old boys or have some hungry 16-year-old boys in your family, you know how much they can eat. So we should, so anyway, Prabhupada made this comment. That was just a side point, but I was a hungry 17-year-old. I was actually just turned 18 when I became a devotee. So I love being in the kitchen, but of course I became inspired to cook and wash pots and chop vegetables, etc., etc. And I knew that prasadam distribution was pleasing to Prabhupada, and he told us many times, chant, dance, take prasadam. So I enjoyed my time in the kitchen. Somehow or other, I kept getting kitchen service. And then cooking classes came along, and because I was cooking at the restaurants, people were saying, hey, this food is so good. You know, how do you ever teach? And the manager of the restaurant at that time, Brihaspati, he said to me, you should run some cooking classes. And he said, you should call it Cooking with Kurma. He said, it just rolls off the tongue. And I said, yeah, that sounds good. So I started teaching cooking classes, and they went down very well. And since that time in 1978, I've done like probably close to 6,000 cooking classes. And people just become very enlivened. People become devotees from attending cooking classes. People become devotees from attending our restaurants and eating prasadam. People become transformed from eating pakoras and koftas and halva. And so it's a wonderful type of outreach, and it's a way to get nice prasadam all the time, also as well as a side perk. But anyway, so yes, it's a big science, the science of prasadam distribution and cooking for Krishna, cooking bona fide things, not speculating, but cooking things that are tasteful and nicely cooked.
And according to your observation, analysis, and experience, if Srila Prabhupada were with us today and seeing the restaurants, the temples, what would he say about the cooking today in the Hare Krishna movement?
What would he be saying?
Yeah, I mean, what do you think he would be satisfied, fully satisfied? If not, what's missing? And of course, it's a subjective analysis, but perhaps you are the highest ISKCON authority on cooking, and you must have meditated a lot. And especially this last remark about bona fide cooking, not speculation, inspired me to ask you this.
Yeah, it's a big topic. It's a big topic. I think it's very important that devotees follow recipes unless they're very expert cooks. It's just like, if you know how to cook already, then you can adjust recipes a little bit. But if you're not an experienced cook, don't speculate. And also find out what, Krishna likes to eat. Now, of course, sometimes people say, well, I like to cook pizza, and I like to cook lasagna, and I like to cook cannelloni, because, for whatever reason, perhaps they like to eat those things, but they cook those things and they offer them to Krishna. And of course, in different countries of the world, they have their favorite cooking styles. In Hong Kong, they like to cook in a certain way. In Italy, they cook in a certain way, as you know. And in Russia, they cook in a certain way. And so the local devotees tend to enjoy eating the foods of their homeland. So if those things can be made into vegetarian dishes, then you can offer those things to Krishna. Prabhupada didn't have any objections about that. In some temples, they're very strict, and they say you have to make dal, rice, chapatis. I remember I was in Italy, and they made khichdi for breakfast because they said, hey, the temple president said, we've got to make khichdi. I don't like khichdi, but we have to make khichdi. So they made khichdi, but they put rosemary in it, and they gave everybody a bottle of olive oil, and everyone was pouring the olive oil on top of the khichdi with the rosemary inside, and they're saying, that's better. Lots of olive oil on top. So, everyone has their favorites, but, you can offer those things to Krishna. Some devotees in some temples say, my temple president, he won't allow me to do this. We have a different standard. So in a nutshell, in every temple, there's different standards. Try to follow the standard that's there in your temple. And, it's a big issue. It's a big topic. But for most places, I think Prabhupada will be very happy to see so many beautiful offerings going on. You go to Mayapur, and there's wonderful, just acres and acres of Mahaprasadam that's offered every day, and all of beautiful standard. And I think Prabhupada will be very happy to see that the science of cooking has been passed on. There are still speculations, and having said that, there are still some pretty scary things that get put on deity plates around the world. But all in all, I think Prabhupada will be very happy to see that the prasadam is going out very nicely.
And among all the recipes that Srila Prabhupada personally taught to the devotees, which one is your favorite, and why?
Well, it's a hard question. I don't have a favorite. Every day I feel like eating something different, and that becomes my favorite thing for the day. But I must say there was one dish that Prabhupada taught us how to cook. Prabhupada actually did a lot of cookery classes in Australia, not official cookery classes. In New Zealand, he showed the devotees how to make burfi. In Perth, he showed the devotees how to make pera. He personally cooked it. In Melbourne, he showed the devotees how to make a wonderful vegetable dish. The devotees cooked for him one day, and he wasn't so happy with how he turned out. He said to Deepak, at the time, Deepak Das, my godbrother, he said, tomorrow I will show you how to cook. Prabhupada went into the kitchen, and he made a wonderful dish with deep-fried potatoes, deep-fried eggplant, deep-fried paneer, cooked in whey. And it's in my first cookbook. It's a recipe that was given by Prabhupada impromptu, and it became a very great favorite in Australia. Prabhupada said, you should cook this dish for the meat eaters, because there were big, juicy chunks of very dark paneer cheese in this vegetable dish. And Prabhupada said, the meat eaters will love this very much. He said, it is a meat eater's delight, quote unquote. So that recipe became famous in Australia as meat eater's delight. I remember I cooked this recipe one day for a group of Australian men who were very gross, and I don't even know how we got to be catering for them, beer drinking, ex-army men. And so I served out this meat eater's delight, and I remember one man came up to me at the serving counter afterwards, and he said, hey, I really like that meat dish that you've made. He said, any chance of getting a bit more? And I said, yes, certainly. Here's some more. And I filled up his bowl with meat eater's delight, pure vegetarian. So yes, Prabhupada taught us how to cook in Australia as well.
So I think it's time to stop for two reasons. One, because we're already here for 1 hour. And second, because for many people, it's still Janmashtami and they're still fasting. So all this eating about food may be very agitating.
Yes, it's a hard one. It's a hard thing to talk about on fast.
Here in Mayapur, we still have 5 hours to midnight.
Yeah.
So I guess
we've got a lot more.
So many thanks to Kurma Prabhu for being with us and sharing so many ambrosial episodes from Srila Prabhupada and the devotees serving Srila Prabhupada and the kitchen religion that Srila Prabhupada brought. So thank you all for watching this video live or the recording of it. And this is part of a series on Srila Prabhupada in the far corners of the world. So today we heard about Australia, and we have other special events on Sweden, on Malaysia, Indonesia, Japan, Russia. So stay tuned. Check our Facebook page. Facebook GBC SPT. This is the GBC Strategic Planning Team. We wish to serve the devotees by helping making known all these visits and preaching missions of Srila Prabhupada. Kurma Prabhu, any last message you'd like to share with our viewers?
Last message. Chant Hare Krishna, take prasadam, and dance.
Thank you so much. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna. Hare Krishna.